Welcome back on board the Sputnik with me, Hafsakara Mustafa, standing in again for George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The leak of over 11 million files from a Panama-based law firm, Mossack Fonseca, continues to send shockwaves around the world. The documents, passed on by anonymous sources to Germany's Daily Zeitung, were then sent to the Washington-based International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which then shared them with various international media, including Britain's Guardian and the BBC.
The papers revealed a network of secret offshore deals and loans involving political officials, royalty, as well as celebrities from across the globe. But what do these investments mean? And who do they impact? And what will these revelations lead to?
Hoping to unravel some of the mysteries around the opaque and murky world of international finance is journalist and activist Steve Topple. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Steve, before we sort of go into the consequences of this massive affair, can you just talk us through a bit about what the Panama leaks actually mean and pretty much why the timing?
I think the timing, to start with, is extremely interesting. There's been an undercurrent of discontent over the past few years with the situation with offshore tax havens. There's a lot been bubbling under. Public sentiment is quite angry at the moment. And broader than that, public sentiment with the financial system that we live under generally. People really aren't happy. And I think this brings a lot of things to a head, if you like, surrounding just how corporations and wealthy individuals do go about their business.
The 1%, basically.
The 1%, exactly, yeah. That sort of fabled, fabled notion that we all talk about, the 1% versus the 99. So I think it's come to a head now. I think the timing of the leak is very interesting because it's quite well known they've been preparing this information and had it ready over a year ago and have had access to it for possibly up to 7 years. So why they've done it now? Various reasons. There's a lot of debate surrounding that. I think it's important for a number of reasons because it shines a really bright light on the machinery, if you like, of the offshore tax system. It gives the public, hopefully, unprecedented access to how these things actually work and operate. And it also casts quite a dark shadow over the global financial industry generally. I don't think they come off well from this at all.
But the public doesn't really have access to all of them because obviously it's been very selective and the choice has been made by the consortium.
This is the problem, yes. The director of the ICIJ has come out and outrightly says that they're not going to release all the information on this. Now we're talking 11.5 million files, over 2 terabytes of data, and so far we've had 149 files. So if they're not going to release it all, then how is the public going to get a full picture? They've called it responsible journalism by not releasing all the information. I beg to differ on that. Responsible, I say it's fairly irresponsible because ultimately it's such an issue which is in the public interest. Surely it should be up to us to decide what is responsible, what is worthy of scrutiny and what isn't.
The affair has actually claimed its first scalp, which is the Prime Minister of Iceland. Obviously, it turned out that he had an offshore firm in the name of his wife. Now, it wasn't exactly illegal, but the fact that he didn't reveal it when he became Prime Minister obviously indicated something untowards. Do you reckon that other heads are going to roll? And if so, which ones?
I think the thing with Iceland is interesting purely because they were seen as a slightly revolutionary country, if you like. After the 2008 crash, they jailed a load of bankers and gave them a good bash, as it were. And for him to then be seen to be operating within that system, which he was obviously fervently against, I think that's where the public anger in Iceland has come from. Will we see more heads roll? David Cameron, I think he's... I think he's probably fairly safe. The timing of this is wonderful. Parliament's on recess, aren't they? So he couldn't get a battering in PMQs yesterday from Corbyn. And I think, given the timing and the fact that Parliament will be back next week, I think he'll probably get away with it, as these Conservative MPs generally do.
One of the biggest names in this revelation is President Putin, but he's actually not. Actually, in the documents, the media are just mentioning him. How funny is that?
I know, it's like you've got Putin's brother's dog's niece's cousin was using an offshore tax haven or something. But yeah, his name wasn't.
So it's him, yes.
Yeah. So it's Putin bad. No, his name wasn't even in there. I think. The whole thing with this narrative, I mean, if we'd have known that this leak was going to come out on Sunday, you could have written a script for it Saturday night, because we've gone from bash Putin, bash China, bash these regimes, as they call them. Then we've moved on to having a cheeky dig at David Cameron. Yesterday, all the celebrities came out. And then today, when interest is dying down, the news turns to what is actually important in this, which is the City of London and the corporations that are operating within this. But it's now day 4 of the leak. Public interest has probably waned on it, so they made sure they got the stories they wanted us to talk about, i.e., as you say, Putin and his rather lame connection to it all. They made sure they got that out there straight away. So, I mean, it's a nonsense.
But you
really.
say, you mentioned China as well. They were mentioned, actually. There were members of the Chinese regime mentioned.
Yeah.
So how is that received there?
I'm not sure. I think that China's interesting at the moment. They're a country which is trying to swerve away from, if you like, the pseudo-communist regime they had, and they're trying to move into more Western model where everything is service industry based, like they're laying off about 5 million workers over the next 5 years, aren't they, in the public sector. So how that news will be received in China, I'm not sure. They're still quite authoritarian, aren't they? And the state does control the public's perception of their government. I think that, that's going to be interesting how that pans out, what the public in China do think of it.
Back in the UK, do you think that at the very least, just to sort of give something to public opinion, which is very angry considering all the financial scandals over the past 5-7 years, is there going to be some change to banking regulations, something that says that, you know, no more of this impunity for so many high-ranking officials?
I think the government will have to be seen to be doing something now. Yes, because Cameron and his colleagues have been going on and on and on for years, since the last crash in 2008. When they were in opposition, they were saying about they need tighter regulations. However, they've sat on their hands and done nothing. So I think now it will be imperative for them to do something. The problem being, is this going to make any difference? This whole system of offshore tax havens, the money that goes into it and comes out, is so entrenched and systemic within the world we live in that the proposals they're tabling, which is country-by-country reporting of companies that use them, blacklisting of tax havens, and base erosion, profit-shifting countermeasures, which is where companies move enough money offshore to make sure that the country they're registered in, they pay very little tax. Is this going to make any difference? It's like this system is like a hydra, if you like, a mythological hydra. You chop off one head and another one's going to appear somewhere else. And I just think that it's too deep and too rotten for it to ever be changed. If I can just give you one brief example just to show how deep this goes. Oxfam. Charity campaigning against poverty. They released a report at the start of this year saying 62 people own as much wealth as 50% of the world. They accept donations from the Hewlett Charitable Foundation, as in Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard operates in tax haven Bermuda, so Oxfam's money that they're being given is coming directly from a tax haven. This is how deep it goes. Even charities are receiving money from the offshore business, if you like. It's somewhat mind-blowing how big it is, and I just think any regulation is going to be pretty inconsequential.
You mentioned Bermuda, and I've heard of many Caribbean islands as tax havens, but not Panama. Obviously, this comes from a Panamanian law firm, but why there? What is it with Panama? Is there what more secrets do they hold?
This is the thing, and this is quite an interesting point, actually. Why Panama? And it might eventually shed some light on exactly where this leak has come from, because Panama signed a free trade agreement with the US in 2012, which at the time, there was a lot of people up in arms saying this will encourage tax avoidance, this will encourage the rich to get richer. Panama in itself isn't one of the main protagonists of offshore tax evasion, if you like. I think this firm is obviously a big middleman, but they're not one of the main culprits. It's the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands. So the fact it's come from Panama, I think that's one to watch. I think if and when we find out who actually, because they hacked in someone, apparently, was what the law firm said. It was an outside hack, nothing internal. So someone's got in there. And it will be interesting to watch where this leak might have actually come from and who ultimately is going to benefit from it.
What I'm interested in now is that obviously you say it goes in very, very deep and it involves incredibly powerful people. But I mean, what do we expect? Is something going to give, something going to happen, or within a week are we just going to go back and have a nice cup of tea and forget all about it?
This is the thing, it's like we're all, oh my goodness, people are dodging tax, like it's some shock. A lot of us know it isn't. It's been well reported. Like back in 2012, there was big revelations about, I think it was 13 trillion was avoided via offshore tax havens. We all kind of went, oh, and then, oh, right, EastEnders is on. And is anything going to change? I don't know. I mean, another challenge is, of course, we have the media spinning it like hell, as we touched on earlier with Putin and China. They're up to their necks in it as well. The Guardian's Guardian Media Group chief executive, for example, Neil Beckett, he also is an executive director of Sage, the accountancy IT company. Yes. They operate 44 offshore tax havens themselves.
Really?
So it's within the media, the BBC, Rona Fairhead, the Trust's chairman. She's a director of PepsiCo, who operate out of Bermuda. So again, it's just so deep. And as you say, are we in a week's time just going to be now on something else? I think it's up to people like us, media who aren't constrained by corporate interests, and the activists who are very present on social media, and people like the People's Assembly who have a demo next Saturday. It's up to people like us and them to keep pushing this, to make sure that...
Make the link with austerity.
Yes, exactly, it is.
This is the whole point.
This is the whole point.
This is the whole solution to the current austerity programme.
This is what it boils down to. This is just another cog in the wheel of global inequality. It's not just in the West either. I mean, like, there's a company like Chevron. It's the 16th biggest corporation in the world, massive oil company, operate out of 180 countries. They have 264 subsidiaries in Bermuda alone. 264 individual companies, all sucking money out of places like Central African Republic, the Congo. All these third world countries are being deprived of money they should be having.
Steve Topple, I think we could talk about this for another good hour, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Now, in the next part of the show, we're going to be talking about something almost as mysterious as international finance. Stay tuned. TTIP next. Welcome back to Sputnik. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, is a series of trade negotiations being carried out between the EU and the US. As a bilateral trade agreement, TTIP is about reducing the regulatory barriers to trade for big business.
Issues such as food safety law, environmental legislation, and banking regulations are all affected by the new trade deal. Yet, despite its importance and the impact these deals are likely to have on Britain and the European Union as a whole, they are conducted in secret with very little transpiring in the media.
Described as an assault on European and US societies by transnational corporations by War on Want's executive director John Hilary, TTIP has the potential to affect every single one of us. To explain in detail why is member of Stop TTIP expert group, Dr. Lucy Reynolds. Lucy, we know that something is being conducted in secret, and we know that there is concern amongst the general public. But before we go into that, can you just tell us a bit about what TTIP is and what it represents?
Certainly. It's known as a trade deal, but it's one in a series of trade deals around the world. And generally in the past, trade deals have been aimed at reducing barriers to trade. So that's sort of customs tariffs, that kind of thing. This one isn't, because those tariffs are already very low between the parties to this, which is the European Union and the USA. And we have a parallel agreement about to be signed, actually, even earlier, September, October, maybe, with a forthcoming day of action against it in May, which is the Canadian equivalent, which is called CETA. But the TTIP deal would tie the US and the European Union into a single market. And the changes in it, well, as you say, it's very hard to find out what's in it, actually. They've required people who go and look at it, only members of the European Parliament and MPs. They're allowed to go in, but they're not allowed to take any notes that they can take out, or any photographs or anything like that. They're not allowed to take the text out. So we don't really know exactly what's in it, but we have had some information about it, mainly from the way they kind of advertise it, which is not all that convincing. So we see that there's going to be unification of standards, which will generally be down to the US level, because that's the form for trade agreements around the world. And so we're going to lose a lot of protections that we have in the European Union and in Britain, because if they are inconvenient to the profit stream of foreign corporations, American corporations, who are allowed to do things a different way at home, they can very likely be able to claim that they can reduce the standards so that they will be able to trade on equal terms. So that's likely. And also a very major target of it is, in fact, the privatisation of public services in Europe. There's a lot of floating free capital that's looking for investment opportunities, and honestly, tapping outsourcing money from public services and privatisation streams generally is easier than earning an honest living in fierce competition against each other. So that is a big part of TTIP, and that, in fact, is the thing that brought it to our notice, the threat to the NHS that it represents, because in 2012 an instruction was given in internal EU circles in Brussels to start the harmonisation, or complete if that had already been started, of national legislation on public services to US standards in preparation for TTIP, and delegates to that meeting were told that the priority sector was the healthcare sector. So obviously, since the NHS is in an English-speaking country and the US is an English-speaking country, the NHS is the big target.
We know that the NHS is obviously in the line of fire, as it were, and that's been sort of mentioned quite a few times, but what are areas that the public really should be concerned about, other than the NHS?
Well, we've got form from the trade treaty mob on food quality standards. So there's been fights in the past over hormone-treated beef coming into the EU. We've been able to block that because we have higher standards, but we won't be able to enforce those any longer. So we're going to lose those sorts of protections. And unfortunately, trade law it's not really a set of laws. It's a kind of regime written by the corporations for the corporations, enforceable against the people by their governments, who have to be induced to go along with this somehow. And under those arrangements, everything is very much swung towards the big corporate interest. So where there are points at issue, they are decided through secret trade tribunals, staffed by their people. They don't publish any information about the decisions, and they don't have to follow precedent. So basically they're kind of making it up as they go along for them and their cronies. And therefore, what looks on paper like something reasonable, for example, the exemption for public health services, actually is very tight indeed. So as well as standards right the way through the economy, but particularly around health and safety standards, we're basically looking at a situation where the NHS is going to be forced into a situation of full privatisation to look very much like US healthcare, unless we're able to renationalise it pretty much immediately. And the political will to do that is obviously hard to come by at the moment, because our politicians are generally trying to encourage the TTIP deal and are trying to kind of market it to us. Although those that find out about what's actually in it tend to be rather more critical, and Peter Lilly MP has come out this last week against TTIP. I think he's probably been reading our literature, actually. He's really quite well informed, and he quite correctly points out that the thing is a heist and we should have nothing to do with it. So when even people like that are coming out, you know, there's a sign of...
Never mind Peter Lilly MP. Donald Trump has even even, raised concern over this TTIP deal. And he is obviously the big, successful businessman. So if even he is raising question marks, then who is behind this TTIP deal?
Well, I think it's a conglomerate of corporate interests. John Perkins, in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, about his time at the forefront of the privatisation wave, explained that after the oil shocks in the 1970s, when the oil-producing countries, which weren't the general centres of power, got together as a bloc and exerted some of that power back in the opposite direction, at that point, there developed a very tight cartel of power between the different interests. So industrial interests, extractive interests, banking interests, and the general kind of hierarchy, locked in much, much tighter. And the trade lobby is a representation of that. I mean, it's been going in its present form since the Second World War with the launch of the Bretton Woods organisations, the World Trade Organisation, the IMF, and the World Bank. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a hydra-headed thing, and all of the marketing that it puts out is just lovely. But actually, when you look at the nitty-gritty, that's where the problem comes. And it's very important to note in this connection that we can't see the text of the TTIP agreement or the CETA agreement or really any of it openly. My master's dissertation back in the 1990s involved analysing the actual legal text of what was supposed to be a poverty initiative. And oh boy, what was in that? It was disgusting. Basically, it was like, well, we'll give you some money because you're starving, but you have to turn over all your public services on the worst terms. So really, TTIP and the like is just one in a line of a series of corporate takeovers. And unless we resist it, really quite forcefully, it will go through. However, resistance to it is not impossible, because the whole reason that they're at the moment trying to patch together the regional trade treaties around the world into a single net is because they lost at the last round. In 2001, in the Doha meeting of the World Trade Organization, there was a push to get through the General Agreement in Trade and Services, which would have basically kind of forced open all public services globally on the same sort of terms. And the activists won the battle, which is why they basically stalemated it more than anything. So this is why we're now facing this. So public awareness is growing, actually.
How close are we to this TTIP deal being signed?
Well, in some ways it looks like the inevitable march, really, because our politicians are going along with it. So we really need an exceptional pushback, I think, to educate them more than anything, because anybody that does actually look at it sees that it's completely outrageous.
So what are the groups that are actually getting involved in challenging this TTIP? Because, obviously, again, the secrecy means that people are simply not alarmed enough to attempt to challenge it. Are there other groups such as yours that are involved in sort of trying to get answers from the government and actually pushing for reversal of these agreements?
Well, yes, actually, that mobilisation has gone pretty well. It's been fairly spontaneous, but headed by a very effective activist called Linda Coucher, who was in that meeting in Brussels in 2012 when she heard that our public services were about to go down. And so it's gone from one person back then to a national network. There's an expert group which works on the inside, and then a dissemination group called No TTIP. We've got a newspaper here. So various initiatives to spread the word around the country. I've done a fair amount of speaking on this, despite the fact that it's in many ways not my primary area of interest. I'm very worried about the NHS privatisation in particular. We have a little bit of kind of feedback on this, if you like, a little bit of market research from the fact that many MPs reported that they were going around canvassing for the election and were being treated to education on TTIP on the front doorsteps of their constituents by their constituents, which is actually pretty impressive from one person only a few years ago. But, the content of this is really very frightening.
Very, very briefly, is it still reversible?
Well, yes, it is. If what was really a fairly kind of ad hoc bunch of third world activists and a few people in the first world who are technicals who came to assist them, if that can stalemate the thing, it's possible to do that. But we need to make people aware. So thank you very much for giving the issue the exposure. In particular, this is a very big threat to the NHS. Unless we can renationalise the NHS immediately, this is really the end of it.
Dr. Reynolds, I'll have to stop you there. Thank you very much. You've been a great guest. You've heard the experts, so now it's time to hear what you have to say. Gayatri, what's been going on the social media?
Well, you think that TTIP is still a big mystery, but from the social media response, it doesn't seem that way. We've had less response on the Panama matter when we asked the people whether Cameron should resign based on the revelation about his father and trust funds, to which Ricardo Picasso says, he has been caught red-handed with nowhere to hide. Parliament should be recalled for an immediate debate about our democracy. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. On TTIP, loads and loads of response. Louise McDade says, assisted by the Tories, it puts our public services out to privatization. I would vote leave the EU. And Roger the Dodger says, after 45, a few states rule the world. After TTIP, a few corporations will rule. Simples.
Pretty scary stuff when you look at it, isn't it?
Very much. And those are all the tweets for this week.
Which brings us to the end of the show, with me, Hafsa Kara Mustafa, standing in for George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri. But you can stay in touch with us on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. Until next week, it's been marvelous.